Why is Africa so poor? Why is Africa not developing, like the rest of the world? What are the biggest problems on this huge continent? Africa is the second largest continent after Asia. About 30% of the world's mineral reserves, 8% of the world's natural gas reserves, 12% of the world's oil reserves are concentrated in Africa. The continent contains 40% of the world's gold and up to 90% of chromium and platinum. The largest reserves of cobalt, diamonds, platinum and uranium in the world are in Africa. So why then is Africa the poorest, underdeveloped continent in the world? I think there are several reasons. Initially, Africa started in worse conditions compared to Europe. There were practically no animals suitable for domestication, no plants that could be cultivated on a large scale. The largest concentration of both of them was in the eastern Mediterranean. That's why the first large settlements appeared there. Civilization was born there. Without a stable source of food, the Africans were forced to spend more time getting it, respectively. Less time was left for crafts and arts. There was no opportunity for the emergence of specialized activities that were not directly related to food production. The absence of pack animals actually blocked the development of land transport. Africans covered all distances on foot and carried all the goods on themselves. All this does not mean that Africa was doomed to backwardness. It simply developed at a different speed than Europe, which is absolutely normal. After some time, the Africans would have come to the same social forms and technologies as the Europeans and Asians, but then their development was interrupted first by the Arab in the north and then by the European invasion. A long black streak began in the history of Africa. The colonialists were not interested in the development of the continent. They simply siphoned off his resources, raw materials and people who were needed to develop their economy. Huge regions were depopulated. Many people did not live, but survived, hiding in the most remote lands, where it was impossible to even think about the development of culture. It was only necessary to survive and preserve freedom. In the 1960s, African states gained freedom. However, their legacy was, to put it mildly, not the best. The population was almost completely illiterate because the colonialists were not engaged in education. Social structures were destroyed because the colonialists were only interested in extracting resources, which was what the entire management system was set up for. The borders of the new states were drawn arbitrarily, often out of convenience of administration or for the sake of dividing single ethnic groups into parts, according to the divide and rule principle. At the same time, there was no political culture as such. In these countries there have never been any parties, no parliaments, no elections, no free discussions. Everything had to start from scratch, and often in conditions of famine and military conflicts. Corruption and bad governments. The fact is that income from natural resources is distributed among a certain circle of people. This money does not go to the development of countries or to improve medicine. All this money goes into the pockets of dictators who feed their inner circle, thanks to which they remain in power. It's like going back 300 years. When kings and castles bathed in gold and luxury and ordinary citizens suffered from hunger. Wars and climate disasters. Africa is known for quick wars across the continent, from conflicts between communities to full-scale civil wars that have resulted in thousands of deaths and extreme poverty. For example, the first civil war in Liberia is an internal conflict in Liberia in 1989 to 1996, during which more than 200,000 people died. The conflict was resolved only after the intervention of the UN and the Economic Community of West African States. The Great African War, 1998 to 2002, is a war in the territory of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in which more than 20 armed groups representing 9 states participated. By 2008, the war and subsequent events had killed 5.4 million people, mostly from disease and starvation, making it one of the bloodiest wars in world history and the deadliest conflict since World War II. The history of independent Africa is rich in conflicts. For about 50 years, Africa has seen 18 full-scale civil wars, more than 100 military coups, 11 cases of genocide and mass political terror. In addition, natural and man-made disasters in Africa have caused widespread suffering on the continent. Africa has suffered quite a few disasters, from earthquakes to floods, which are the key disasters on the continent. One of Africa's most devastating natural disasters is recurrent droughts. Some countries suffer disasters from floods, plant diseases, locust invasions, which in a few hours can destroy the entire crop of fields or plantations. In East Africa, there is the largest fault in the Earth's crust on land. It stretches along the Red Sea through the Ethiopian highlands to the mouth of the Zambezi River. The African lithospheric plate is moving apart here, so earthquakes and volcanic eruptions are frequent. Rapid population growth. The birth rate in Africa is 2.5 times the death rate, so the population is growing very fast. Annual population growth reaches 3% according to UN forecasts. The population of Africa by 2100 will increase to 3 billion people. Such overpopulation will lead to widespread destruction of the environment, which is dangerous not only for plants, birds, and animals, but, ultimately, for people themselves. A large birth rate is observed here due to early marriages and the desire of parents to have as many children as possible, which provides them with a large number of workers. Bad education. Although most African countries gained independence about 50 years ago, only a few have introduced compulsory primary education. Secondary education is even worse. In most African countries, only 4 or 5% of young people in the relevant age group acquire secondary education. In most African countries, less than 1% of youth in the relevant age group attend tertiary education, while in industrialized countries the figure is 25 to 75%. Moreover, young Africans who become students rarely specialize in science or technology. Lack of education leads to a decrease in the level of human capital, which ultimately leads to a decrease in productivity and, as a result, to poverty. Due to the lack of sanitation in most of the continent and the harsh climatic conditions in African countries, there are a lot of diseases such as AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, Ebola, and many others. Lack of clean drinking water, lack of food. Some families eat once a day, sometimes not every day. All this leads to mortality at a young age. Africa needs new rulers whose interest lies in the welfare of their people. People who could bring investment to the country. To give people normal living conditions, to carry out reforms in education and medicine. Give people a future.